Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be learning about rounding to the hundreds place. It is very similar to rounding to the tens, but it's actually a little bit easier. So I'm excited to show you guys this today. The first thing you need to know is that we are not rounding to the tens, we're rounding to the hundreds. So 100 has how many zeros in it there? 2. All of our answers today are going to have 2 zeros in them, at least 2. Some might have 3, depending on if we have to bump up to the next 1,000 or not. But most of our answers today are going to have 2 zeros in them. They all have to have at least 2. That's the difference between rounding to the hundreds place and the tens place. When you're rounding to the tens, you underline the tens. When you're rounding to the hundreds, you underline the hundreds. Good job. So today we're going to start out. Let's find the hundreds place for this number. Ones, tens, hundreds. I'm going to underline him because that's the place we're rounding to, the hundreds place. And instead of spotlighting the ones, we're going to spotlight the tens because the tens is the one right beside the 4. This number is going to still tell this number what to do. Now, the same rule applies. 4 or less, we're going to let it rest. 5 or above, we're going to give it a shove. Is this circled number 4 or less or 5 or above? Is 8 4 or less, or is 8 5 or above? 8 is 5 or above. So we're going to give this 4, he's going to tell the 4 to give it a shove. What comes after 4? 5, good. And the circled number becomes a 0, just like always. And this is where it's a little bit different. This 8 is also going to change to a 0 because we are rounding it to the hundreds place, okay? That means all of our answers are going to have 2 zeros in them, not 1. So we also changed the ones place to a 0 here as well, okay? So both of the ones and the tens are going to be becoming zeros today. On every single number we do today, the ones and the tens are going to become zeros because we are rounding to the hundreds, and hundreds has 2 zeros in it. So let's look at another number. Let's do 822, okay? Let's underline, what place are we rounding to today? The hundreds. So let's underline the hundreds. And spotlight the BFF, which is right beside of him, the tens. And the 2 is going to tell the 8 to do what? Is this 4 or less to let this rest? Or is this 5 or above to give it a shove? 2 is 2 less, is 2 4 or less, or is 2 5 or above? 2 is 4 or less, so we're going to let that 8 rest. He gets to stay in 8. And the 2 becomes a 0, and this 2 also becomes a 0 to round it to 800, okay? Let's try a 4-digit number, rounding that to the hundreds place. 2,351. This is where it gets a little bit more complicated because we have added that extra number in. But just like before, this number is typically just going to drop straight down and stay the same. So let's underline our hundreds place, which we have a 3 in. Spotlight the 5. And is the 5 going to tell the 3 to bump up or to let the 3 rest? The 5, is that 4 or less, or is this 5 or above? It's 5 or above. So he tells the 3 to give it a shove up 1 to a 4. The 5 becomes a 0 because it has a 0 around it. The 1 also becomes a 0 because we need 2 zeros to round to the hundreds. Drop the comma straight down, and also you're going to drop this 2 straight down because the 2 is not being affected by the hundreds here, okay? Unless this number is a 9 that gets bumped up to the next 10, then the thousands place is just going to stay the same. Okay, let me show you what I mean by that so you're not confused when you get to it, okay? Sometimes you're going to have numbers that look like this, where it's very close to the next 100, but the next 100 is going to be the next 1,000. So let me just show you. Here, we're going to still underline our hundreds, circle our tens. Because this is a 9, and because the 6 is 5 or above, the 6 is telling the 9 to bump up. The problem is I cannot bump up to a 10 because I cannot put 10 in a single place because 10 is not a digit. It's two numbers, okay? Since it's telling it to bump up, and I can't bump up the 9 any higher, I'm actually going to bump up this whole number right here, 29, to the next number. 29 is going to bump up to 30. Or you can just think of it as the 9 is telling the 2 to bump up to a 3. And the 9 becomes a 0, the 6 becomes a 0, and the 3 becomes a 0. That's because, guys, 2,960, if we looked at it on a number line, then we would have this, okay? The next 100 after 2,900 is 3,000. Because if you have 2,900 and you're counting by hundreds, and you added them all together, it's 3,000. That is the next hundreds, okay? So that's why it's bumping it up to 3,000. Because right here, this number, 2,963, comes like right here on the number line. And that's closer to 3,000. That's the next 100, okay? So let's look at one more normal, what I would say normal. This is not your typical rounding experience. Typically, the thousands place is just going to stay the same and you can drop it down. But sometimes, this is a rare case where you will have a 9 that's bumping up, okay? If the 9 is not bumping up, like if this was 4 or less over here, then it would just stay 2,900. The 2 would drop down. But because the 9 is having to bump up, and there's nothing really else to bump it up to, we're bumping it up to the next 1,000 because that is the next 100. I know that sounds confusing, and I hope that made sense, my explanation. If not, then please let me know, and I would be happy to help you. All right, let's try one more regular rounding to the hundreds place. We're still rounding to the hundreds, okay? Hundreds, hundreds, hundreds. Ones, tens, hundreds, underline the 3, circle the BFF. Is the 5 telling the 3 to bump up or to stay a 3? Is this 4 or less to let this rest? 5 or above to give it a shove. This is 5 or above, so we're going to give the 3 a shove. Push them up to a 4. The 5 becomes a 0 because it's circled. The 1 also becomes a 0 because we need 2 zeros for it to be hundreds. And then we drop the 4 in the thousands place. So that would be your answer, 4,400. I hope this video helped explain some things, how to round to the hundreds place, and helps make it a little bit more sense to you. If you need me at all, please feel free to contact me, and I'd be more than happy to help you with this.